Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Juliana Walker, the Associate Director of Programs and Events for the School of Arts and Sciences. I'm here to welcome you today to Knowledge by the Slice Lunchtime Talk. The Knowledge by the Slice series is sponsored by the School of Arts and Sciences to give the campus community a chance to hear from some of the school's outstanding faculty members. Professor Jonathan Moreno has kindly agreed to join us today. His talk is based on his most recent book titled The Body Politic, The Battle Over Science in America. Dr. Moreno is the David and Lynn Silfen University professor. He was one of Penn's first pick professors. He holds appointments in the History and Sociology of Sciences and Philosophy departments in the School of Arts and Sciences, and in Medical Ethics and Health Policy in the Perelman School of Medicine. He is also a senior fellow at Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. Professor Moreno has described his works as a combination of bioethics with the history of ideas, technology, and public affairs. The Body Politic in the Body Politic, he explores how bioethical issues, such as those posed by advances in stem cell and gene research, have become part of our political discourse. Following the presentation, we should have plenty of time for your questions. And we're also experimenting today with a live webinar, so we may also be taking a few questions from our remote audience. We hope you enjoy the talk and the pizza, and please be prepared to ask questions. Let's all welcome Professor Moreno.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliana. Can you hear me? Are we working? Yes? More or less? So it's lovely to be here. Let's see. Nice day, pizza. Nice day, pizza. You've made a judgment. I'm going to move pretty expeditiously through my slides because I do have more to say than I can say in 20, 30 minutes or so about this topic. But much of it may not be worth saying, so I'll try to move along. I want to give you a little background first about why I happened to write this book. And really, if you're not going to make hundreds of thousands of dollars on a book, you really better write it because you've an itch you want to scratch. And that was true in my case. The itch was, I realize we're on camera, so I should not be too far out of the line of sight, right? Okay, you can, thank you. For 7 years, I've been associated with a think tank in Washington, as Juliana mentioned, called the Center for American Progress, some of you know about the CAP. It was founded by John Podesta, who is Bill Clinton's chief of staff. And CAP, to a great extent, was created because of a sense on the moderate left that the right had really captured the public policy agenda and was driving it, and that there wasn't an effective response from, again, what I'm calling the moderate left. I should say, by the way, that I leave my politics at the classroom door. I'm really good at, and I probably will do that a little bit today, at persuading people that the other side is right. But since I do have a little more flexibility, since you're not a class, I'm going to be a little more upfront with my own views in the next few minutes. So one of the issues that came about when I got at CAP, at that time I was on a sabbatical from the University of Virginia in the spring of 2005. I was working on a committee, co-chairing a committee for the National Academy of Sciences on guidelines for human embryonic stem cell research. And as many of you may remember, this was a very live issue. President Bush had taken a position on stem cell research involving the limitation of the lines that were available for funding in stem cell biology and embryonic stem cell biology. And scientists were a little uncertain about what the actual rules were based on which they could do their research. So I was working on that report in the spring of 2005. Also in the spring of 2005, you might remember there was the Terry Schiavo case. And I sort of became an on-air person for CAP once they realized I was a bioethics professor in their midst. As John Podesta likes to say when he introduces me, I was sort of a walk-on for them because unlike so many people in those tanks, I've never had any Capitol Hill experience. I've never worked in a White House. I'm sort of an odd duck. But I found myself, and this is getting back to why I got interested in writing this book, particularly in the stem cell debate, I found myself struggling with the question, well, at what point am I an academic analyst of an issue like this, and at what point do I become an advocate? And I got into some exchanges, in fact, right around the time that I got to Penn in 2007, online exchanges with people who were on the other side of the issue. And I sort of felt myself being sucked into a sort of black hole of narcissism. You know, I was a high school debater, and so I got to a point where I felt like I was focusing more on making debating points and being being an advocate than I was really being an academic and sort of policy analyst. So I thought, well, there must be a way to step out of the conventional sort of pro-life, pro-choice, liberal, conservative, science, anti-science view of this issue. There must be something that I could bring to this conversation that's a little different. And that was what I tried to do in the Body Politic. So there it is. That's the cover. So the Body Politic is premised on the fact that biology has changed. The life sciences are now increasingly, as you know, experimental. The biology traditionally was an observational discipline. It was taxonomic. People would go out into the fields and they would record genus and species. But starting somewhere around the middle of the 19th century, and certainly very much so today, what's happening in biology is that people at places like Penn are actually manipulating variables in the laboratory, and they're the building blocks of life that they're moving around. Synthetic biology, genetics, stem cell biology. And so the new biology has moved us into an interesting new era. And the one episode that is the most familiar to us, of course, and the one where I think the politics of this has really turned on the stem cell debate. So starting with Dolly, the cloning of Dolly in 2006, the first cloned mammal, President Bush's rather restrictive policy on embryonic stem cell lines that could be used in academic research funded by the NIH, going into popular culture, right, with the Clone Wars, presidential commissions looking at the question of stem cells, and then, of course, the stem cell debate and the cloning issue got mixed up with each other. This is actually part of the problem, I think, of this topic, that first Dolly was cloned, and then 2 years later, independently, you had the isolation of human embryonic stem cells for the first time in the laboratory, first at Wisconsin by Jamie Thompson, who is a Penn alum, by the way, and by John Gearhart, who was then at Hopkins, who is now a colleague of ours at Penn. So it was a period in which we entered what I like to call the new biopolitics. So many of you have read Michel Foucault, historian and philosopher, although some of my philosophy friends aren't so sure he's really a philosopher, and some of my historian friends are definitely not sure he's an historian. But I think at the very least, Foucault is extremely provocative. And so in general, Foucault used the term biopolitics, kind of popularized the word before his death in 1984. And for Foucault, biopolitics involved the control over bodies or groups of bodies, populations. And I counterfactually, I kind of theorized that had Foucault lived, he would have seen a new biopolitics, a biopolitics that involved control over cells, over tissues, over the information contained in our cells and tissues. This is the arena of the new biopolitics. And there's some tragic irony in the fact that Foucault was the first really famous person to die of HIV/AIDS, a field that has stimulated a lot of work in trying to understand biological processes and is part of the new biopolitics. So, but I started out teaching history of American philosophy, sort of an American studies person 35 years ago. And this is the perspective that I try to bring to enrich the discussion about biopolitics, particularly for America. So what's the role of biopolitics in America takes us to the question of what's the role of science in America? What's the role of science and technology in America? I'm going to tell a story that most of you know, either formally or informally. It's part of what it is to be an American, to know this story. So the NSB is the National Science Board. Every 2 years, they do a science indicators report. And I like this little factoid. In their last science indicators report, they had a survey of attitudes that Americans have about science. 68% of Americans say that science is a good thing. That may be more than you thought. Right? But 48% of respondents say it moves too fast. And I think a lot of us feel it moves too fast. I'm not sure whether you think the 4G iPhone is an example of science, but it's clearly an example of technology. And I'm a little annoyed that I don't have the 4G yet. I have to ask Penn to pay for it. Whenever there's a new version of PowerPoint, planned obsolescence, right? It's so annoying because we have to learn it all over again. A new version of Windows, but it's worked very well for us. Obviously Benjamin Franklin and the silly kite thing, but Benjamin Franklin was, perhaps the greatest scientist of his day. He thought of electricity as a liquid. I came from UVA, so this is Monticello. We all know about Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to come back to the founders later. Early 19th century, the Erie Canal, the Transcontinental Railroad, the telegraph, incredibly important before the middle of the 19th century. And then, the rest, as they say, is history, industrialization. We fly, we go to the moon, allegedly. We're probably not going to go back, but it was great once we were there for a few minutes. And then, of course, ICBMs, the iPad. So this is all terrific, right? Half of the growth of the American economy since World War II is directly attributable to science and technology. I'll come back to this in a minute. But we also have the Creation Museum in Kentucky, which is basically the Flintstones in diorama. We have the anti-vaccination conversation, which is championed on the other side of the issue by our own Paul Offit here at Penn. The United States is a funny place with respect to the Enlightenment. On the one hand, this country is the child of the Enlightenment. We are the paradigmatic nation that the founders thought of as the cornerstone of this country is going to be on attracting the best and the brightest. And I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes. But on the other hand, we're also a pretty traditional country. So as compared to Europe, for example, half of Europeans, particularly in Western Europe, say they believe in God. Church attendance in Western Europe is declining. In America, 90% of Americans, in survey after survey, say they believe in God and say that they attend a house of worship. Now, whether they really do or not, it sort of doesn't matter. What counts is that they feel like they should. So we're, on the one hand, a very science and technology dependent country. It's worked for us very well. It helps to define our understanding of progress, the inevitability of progress, our sense of all this business about manifest destiny. But at the same time, we are, in terms of our values, we're a relatively traditional people in the aggregate. And of course, we have these kind of fantasy images of the founders. The founders, although we probably do have too worshipful a view of the founders, my favorite philosopher, John Dewey, said that Americans' worshipfulness of the Constitution is un-American. Nonetheless, they were a pretty remarkable group. And I mentioned Franklin already and Jefferson. But even some of the others were very science technology oriented. So Washington was a surveyor, a highly technical field still. I mean, when I walk past the surveyors even now with those little orange circles on the sidewalk, and those machines that they've got, I still know what the hell they're doing. So very technical, very hard to understand for people like me. Alexander Hamilton wanted to be a doctor. He attended every lecture he could at King's College, what is now Columbia University, on medicine. If General Washington hadn't recognized his brilliance and made him his aide, he would have been a physician. Even outside the founders, Thomas Paine, the great propagandist who wrote Common Sense, spent his dying days in Paris writing a book about cosmology. And he theorized that those points of light in the sky were actually bodies millions of miles away from the Earth. So these were people who, without mythologizing and getting too misty about it, this was a group of people who really, I think, had the feeling that at the end of the 18th century, something was going to happen. That the activities that they could see in the natural world around them, that we were going to learn something about what's going on that was invisible to them still. Jefferson, for example, wrote the patent statute. And the patent statute is in essence still what it was when Jefferson wrote it. It's extremely generous to inventors, which, by the way, is one reason that it's easier for people to get patents on life forms in the US than it is in the European and Japanese patent systems, because we default toward inventiveness and invention and individual creativity. And again, that's worked extremely well, right? So all I have to do is show you the image of the Golden Gate Bridge, and you think of all that the West means, the notion of the future, conquering the wilderness. Who's the great heroic figure in the 19th century? One of them, at least, is the farmer, plowing the fields at the western edge of town. It was never really like that. Right? By the time Frederick Jackson Turner gave his speech at the American Historical Association in 1892, I think it was, on his frontier thesis, what made American democracy different was the frontier. Even by then, people said, "What's Professor Turner talking about? There's no frontier anymore. We're in California. We're digging it up. We're making cities." Nonetheless, the concept of the frontier is incredibly important. The image of the frontier, the fantasy of the frontier, and of course, it takes us right through, the new frontier, the high frontier, the frontier of science in particular. So again, whatever else you say about America, this notion of progress, intimately involved with science and technology, has worked for us very well, but now we're worried. Napoleon is supposed to have said, when China rises, the West falls. So have we gotten to that point? Are we now at the point where, having gotten to the Golden Gate, having achieved our manifest destiny, having met the promise of America, is that it? Are we just like anybody else now? We're finished. Does the American project have a future after the first 250 years? And I think that one of the reasons that we're in a kind of a funk right now as a people, and this is not the first time this has happened, is the sense that we don't quite know what the next step is. What is the next challenge? If we're not going to go to Mars, and by the way, they just stripped the money out of Mars, the Mars project, from the NASA budget, then what's the frontier for us? Now, skepticism about science, though, is also part of our tradition. This is a paragraph from Francis Bacon's posthumously published Utopia, the New Atlantis. And, of course, Bacon was the first person who thought of the difference between basic science, or pure science, and applied science. And in the New Atlantis, these idiots get shipwrecked. It's like one of these enlightened utopias. They get shipwrecked, and the locals explain to them what the society is like. And this is a society in the New Atlantis that is governed by scientists. We would today call scientists. They would have called natural philosophers, but we would call them scientists. And what's interesting is that toward the end of this explanation that the visitors are getting, one of the governors explains that they have secrets, the scientists. And some of these secrets they share with the state, and some they don't. It's as though the scientists are their own party. There's the state, and then there's the scientists. But some of these things, and this goes back, actually, those of you who know some history of medical ethics, to the Hippocratic Oath, right? In the Hippocratic Oath, part of the oath is, I will not share these secrets with people who have not taken the oath, with people who aren't in the fraternity. So, in a way, there's always been a knowledge fraternity. Using the male term, I grant you, the masculine term, because it tended to be men. There's also a kind of fraternity of scientists that's implicit in this, that some of the secrets are maybe too powerful. And this is a really interesting paragraph because it has led some contemporary neoconservative thinkers about science and democracy to observe that this is a problem now. That some of these scientists, particularly the biologists who are doing funky things with genetics and stem cells and synthetic biology, the bird flu case we're going through right now, right? That's a very interesting episode because there's no international system that polices what biologists do in their laboratories. So how did those, you know what I'm talking about with the bird flu issue, the publication in Science and Nature of the data behind what seems to be, although there's differing views about this much more virulent version of bird flu. Tony Fauci at NIH called 80 or 100 people and said, would you please come to Geneva so we can talk about whether we should this should be published? And this is on NIH funding, by the way, right? So only grudgingly, many people went to Geneva, including the principal investigators who want to publish their stuff, including the editors of the journals And they've grudgingly agreed to a moratorium on publication. But, so what's going on here? It's the party of science, which operates, particularly in the 21st century, it seems, independently of any state, independently of the popular will. Those people speak their own language. Many of you are scientists. I don't understand what the hell you're talking about when you're talking about your stuff. When I used to go to, when I was an advisor for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, when there was one either Nobel laureate or next to Nobel laureate giving a talk, one after the other, I realized not only did I know what they were talking about, they didn't know what their colleagues were talking about. It's so specialized. So this is almost a secret, this is in a way a secret society with its own private language. And the power of science, at least the symbolic power of science, often erroneously powerful, must be illustrated by mention, at least, of the history of what I like to call the biopolitics of heredity, or eugenics. And interest in eugenics starts in the ancient world. Galton, Spencer, Darwin, of course, the old boys. This notion of eugenics, hidden back here. Sorry about that. The slide slipped. Is a picture of Carrie Buck, who was sterilized in Lynchburg, Virginia. Her case became a Supreme Court case. Oliver Wendell Holmes agreed with Virginia's policy on sterilizing people who should be sterilized. He said 4 generations of imbeciles are enough. As you know, Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the great progressive members of the history of American judiciary. This is Margaret Sanger, who founded the organization that became Planned Parenthood, also pro-eugenics, to help so that poor women, poor families shouldn't have to have so many babies, they can't take care of them. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt. H.G. Wells, by the way, another pro-eugenics person in the early 19th century, had an affair with Margaret Sanger, which I think is kind of interesting. Right? They didn't have any children. So eugenics obviously gets a bad odor after the Second World War because of programs like Lebensborn in Nazi Germany, which tried to put blonde, blue-eyed people together with other blonde, blue-eyed Aryan people. But we also, just in suburban Philadelphia, there were Better Babies contests in the 30s. Anybody hear of the Better Babies contests? So one of my friend's mothers was a Better Baby. Her mother brought her to the county fair, where she was, as an infant, where she was measured to make sure that she was in proportion. And the cows got the blue ribbon, and some of the babies got blue ribbons too, because they were better babies. Now we come up to this is what I guess this is the people that we were supposed to be producing, that were supposed to come out of these unions. But now some conservatives are saying, well, now are we in an era of liberal eugenics? What's liberal eugenics? Well, let the buyer beware. It's consumer eugenics. It's eugenics from the bottom up. Now I can decide to put a bunch of embryos with my partner into a fertility clinic. They can be scanned for all sorts of properties. We have all kinds of markers. The people at CHOP are doing this every day. And I can decide which embryos we should implant, or at least together we can. So this is perhaps liberal eugenics. It's not state eugenics, but it's basically the same thing. We're going to be able to decide what kinds of babies we should have. And of course, in a certain sense, we already do that now, right? I was screened for Tay-Sachs, for example. Prospective parents can be screened for lots of things, as can embryos. At some point, we're going to be able to screen probably for some characteristics, perhaps like eye color, hair color, skin tone. There's actually a fertility clinic that has already advertised that they'll guarantee you certain eye color or skin tone or hair color, or your money back. Many fertility clinics will guarantee you a baby or your money back. Right? This is not uncommon in the bizarre world of American fertility clinics. And of course, there are companies that we're going to have the $1,000 genome this year. There are over 30 companies. You can spit into something and send it to them, and they'll send you some information back. 23andMe is the Google-owned company that's the biggest one of these, but there's a number of them. Now, I like to say that my wife and I did not have any help. We didn't engage in this kind of deliberate liberal eugenics. Maybe we should have, but these are my kids. There's one of them here. I'll let you be the judge whether that worked out all right. She's on break. She actually does go to college. This began to get very heated in the 90s. And I think the fact that you had certain things happening in the 90s, along with the cloning of Dolly, you also had the increasing divisiveness of American politics. And I think what you also saw was that pro-life organizations began to see that these biological issues that they hadn't paid much attention to, except perhaps to abortion, maybe a little to IVF, these biological issues were becoming important to them. They were becoming part of a pro-life agenda in a certain way. By the way, if you go to the Science Museum in Glasgow, anybody been there and seen Dolly? Sometimes I talk to people who've seen Dolly. She's stuffed in Glasgow in a museum. She's stuffed. She's in a plastic plexiglass case. It rotates, so you don't have to spend the energy walking around her. And it gets better. The Scots, they're very funny. There's hay under her. And if you look really closely, you'll see little sheep droppings in the hay. So Dolly lives. And then, of course, the isolation of human embryonic stem cells that I mentioned before. What strikes me, though, about the new biology and the new biopolitics is that it breaks down traditional political lines. So the standard left-right spectrum that starts in post-revolutionary France, the late 18th century, doesn't work. It's worked pretty well, actually. It's been a very adaptable spectrum framework, although misleading in many ways. But it really doesn't work so well with these issues because if you notice, people like me, innovation-oriented bioprogressives, I'm a bioprogressive. I basically feel, we should innovate, we should let the science move forward. Regulation is fine for me. It's annoying to market conservatives, regulation, but they accept it grudgingly. And libertarians don't like regulation at all. But what all three of these first groups agree on is that science must move on, that there's a generally permissive attitude towards science and technology in these groups, even though on other issues we would disagree. By contrast, you have Christian conservatives and what I call bioconservatives. These would be people who, secular bioconservatives would be people who don't necessarily adopt a traditional religious view, but they believe that traditional values are very important, and that family values, the Protestant ethic, ties us together as a society. It stabilizes us, and that these new biotechnologies undermine the stability of the family. They undermine the stability of male-female relationships. Now at Penn we have gender-neutral bathrooms, right, which for these folks would just show you that we're kind of going crazy here. What is this all about? This is all undermining the glue, the stuff, the framework that makes society stable. Male-female relationships, male-female sex roles. Feminism, obviously, is a big problem for these guys. Standard rights of courtship, and the family itself. Right? Recently, for example, we have Charles Murray from the American Enterprise Institute, who has done some work in which he claims that the problem is now increasingly that white working class families are falling apart. 40% of babies born out of wedlock. Right? So these are all concerns that cluster for these folks. But then there are also green bioprogressives. I would say that there are probably people here who consider themselves to be greens, as to say, you worry about the planet, you hope that we have organic pizza today, you think that we shouldn't have, those plastic water bottles are a terrible thing, you worry about fisheries, you worry about the oceans, you believe in climate change, you worry that companies like Monsanto are bossing around, pushing around subsistence farmers. You're concerned about local fisheries in Asia and how they might be affected by genetically modified fish, like the salmon that we might be producing that are going to go twice as fast because they're genetically modified. You would be a green. And in many ways, you would agree in policy terms with the bioconservatives and the Christian conservatives. You would agree that the science is taking us in directions that are out of our control, that are fundamentally unhealthy, and that we really need to rein in what these scientists are doing. Because after all, who are the scientists really in bed with? They're in bed with government, they're in bed with industry. Who do you think is building these big buildings over here on the other side of Spruce Street? I often ask my students to consider what would Penn look like with no federal funding for science, with no technology transfer. It would look like a few buildings clustered around Locust Walk. Right? That's what it would be. So the academic, industrial, military complex, that too, interestingly enough, is of concern to the Greens, but also to other conservatives. And all this means that science has terrific power. So here's, in 3 presidential debates, the candidates have to have positions on stem cells and cloning. I can guarantee you they were not reading The Origin of the Species the night before their debates. Right? And these kind of get reduced in these silly ways. So here's the liberal take on stem cells is St. Peter looking at the little baby or maybe fetus or embryo angel at the gate. Partial birth abortion? No. Stem cell research. But here's the conservative take, or liberal, that was the conservative take rather, here's the liberal take, faith-based medical science. Here's Dr. George W. Bush. Take 2 aspirin and pray for a Parkinson's cure in the morning. We're going to see more of this in this cycle, I guarantee you. So we have bioconservatives on the left. I can talk more about these groups. You have the strange bedfellows again, industry organizations like BIO, the World Transhumanist Association, basically people like Nietzsche who believe that the future of technology is one that should be embraced, the Cato Institute, the Libertarians. And I want to give you one example of how this is playing out in our political environment. Since the early 90s, there have been rodent models for human disease, and sometimes they've been called the Hugh mouse. So for a disorder called SCID, this is bubble boy disease, severe combined immunodeficiency disorder, there's a mouse model that's been around for 25, 30 years of this disease. And this is an article from Nature using that cute little term, the Hugh mouse. In 2005, USA Today, on the front page, published a report of an Emory University study involving a humanized mouse. And again, used the word Hugh mouse. So I had a colleague at the Center for American Progress at that point who had just come out of the Kerry campaign. Bob Gordon was his name. And he sent me this email. Hugh mouse equals bad message. What does that say to people? The Hugh mouse. It says we're blurring the boundaries between species. I mean, what is human dignity if we can turn a mouse into a man, or give a mouse human-like qualities? This actually got started in many ways with a colleague and friend of mine, Irv Weissman, at Stanford, who's sort of one of the enfants terribles of American science. And he raised the following question about 10 years ago at Stanford. Would it be ethically acceptable for me to make a mouse with a humanized brain? Now, there are mice already in use that have some humanized cells to study very bad diseases like Batten disease in children. But nobody's made a mouse with sort of all the neurons and all the glial cells that have come from a human source. I guess you could put those cells into a mouse embryo, a mouse fetus, see what happens. And Weissman said, it would be very interesting as an experiment to see what this brain would look like. And you could probably do lots of different interesting experiments with this mouse that you can't do with people for ethical reasons if you had one. So this created a big debate at Stanford. And so Stanford did what any great university does when it's faced with a controversial question raised by a distinguished member of its faculty. What do you think they did? They made a committee, right? And they created a committee that was actually, some of you will be future deans of medical schools because you know exactly what to do. So they actually not only made a committee, they made a law professor, a friend of mine named Hank Greeley, the chair of the committee. Hank is a guy who's done a lot of work on law and genetics and bioethics. And the committee reported out about a year later. And they said, well, Professor Weissman could make this mouse, but you have to observe the developing fetal mouse very carefully. And if the architecture of the mouse brain looks very different from the normal architecture of a mouse brain, then you have to stop the experiment. Now, this raises a number of other questions. First of all, does that really tell you anything? If the architecture looks different, what would that mean? Of course, you would expect it to look somewhat different, but there's very little room in there, so you can't grow a neocortex, obviously, in a mouse skull. But then there's the other question, which is, well, wait, if this is a humanized mouse, a mouse with a humanized brain, and you're going to do what to stop the experiment? You're going to kill it. Okay, so now we have another problem, right? As far as I know, this experiment has never been done, but it did raise the hackles of people like the folks who did this website. Maybe you could make a mouse that really talks. There's a wonderful website that I don't have time to show you, but has been up since at least 2001, because I've been using it to teach since at least then. And I don't know who did this, but this website's constantly being modified. You can go talk to a mouse with a humanized brain on this website. His name is Clive, and do this at home. It's still up. Some science grad students with way too much time on their hands. There's a lot more on this website. There's the first pregnant man. There's now video on the website. They keep updating it, which I think is just great. They made up this fake medical center in New York, RYT Hospital at Duane Medical Center. So this is great. But this is the first. You can go talk to Clive, and you can ask Clive what he likes to eat. Obviously, right? Yeah, cheese. Yeah. What his girlfriend's name is. Minnie. Yeah. But this is kind of amusing, but it's also quite real. So, in July 2009, Governor Bobby Jindal in Louisiana signed a bill that criminalizes attempts to make a human-animal hybrid in Louisiana. A 7-figure fine and 10 years at hard labor. And my guess is that hard labor in Louisiana is really hard labor. Now, there are some things I could say about. I've been to Louisiana, and that whole James Carville thing. I mean, I think they've already got this going on. Anyway, and of course, not so far from here, a couple of years ago, a woman who was running for Congress, Ms. O'Donnell, was caught out already believing that Professor Weissman had done his experiment, that scientists have created mice with human brains, and this became an issue in her campaign. We know who this fellow is. This is the creation of Mary Shelley's imagination, a very smart young woman who had a little too much time on her hands. A couple of weeks of bad weather. It was raining every day. She was a follower of the Romantic Science movement. Anybody know what? The Romantic Science movement was sort of the science version of the Romantic poets like Blake. A Romantic Science movement, taking ideas from people like Ben Franklin, thought that maybe you could, now we know about electricity and can control it to some extent in the early 19th century, maybe we could actually take a body or parts of a body, assemble them, put them together, electrify it a certain way, and actually revive a dead body. The Romantic Science movement. And this was fascinating to people. They were just really obsessed with this idea. Interestingly, part of the way that some of the work that is done in labs with stem cells involves little pulses of electricity, and we could talk about neuroscience and what's going on there as well. But here's the moral of the story. Who's the villain in the Frankenstein story?
Are you asking rhetorically or actually?
Actually.
Well, actually, the villain is the creator of the creature, because the creature comes to life and says, all I ever asked for was love and companionship, and you didn't give me that.
Precisely.
And then that's what was turned into a Hollywood monster.
Yeah.
But the creature was an
innocent
humanistic creation of possibility.
The creature is an innocent.
Yeah.
He didn't ask to be created. And now he's put in this position in which he, as you said very well, becomes the villain. Remember, it is the villain, but it's unfair. So, who's the bad guy? The scientist. And this is a trope that you see in a lot of science fiction, that the scientist is the one you have to worry about. Oh, how'd that get in there? Well, another reminder, have we progressed so much? I don't know. On the other hand, of course, he did support stem cell research as governor. So, another example is the end of Dr. Moreau, there are so many versions of this. Dr. Moreau, a horrible movie, but really illustrated this problem. Not too many people saw Splice. Was made by a Canadian group a few years ago. But this is the image, right? The scientist creates this creature. And of course, we could talk about the rise of the Planet of the Apes, a little biosecurity problem, right? Scientists, hubristic scientists, arrogant scientists. It's back to Francis Bacon's hint that scientists have become their own party. And this is part of what we're worried about. Ultimately, of course, what we're concerned about is, and I haven't said much about evolution, I'm going to end with this. Ultimately, what we're worried about is that the new biology is breaking down traditional barriers. Not only culturally in terms of male-female relationships and courtship and the family, but is actually breaking down physical boundaries. Now, this is literally wrong. Right? This is a literally inaccurate depiction of evolution. But this is the way many people think of evolution. We have evolved, according to my neuroscience friends, we've evolved to see the world categorically. There's actually neuroscience evidence that when we're looking at what we believe to be a living thing, an organic thing, the different parts of the brain light up under functional imaging than when we're looking at something that we believe is not a living thing. We are born categorizers. We are evolved to categorize. But what modern biology is doing is breaking down boundaries, even between species, creating new things, new species. It's teaching us that some of the organisms that we can look at under the microscope aren't even a particular species. So this is what is very threatening. And so the point that I like to make in the body politic is that in the final analysis, one of the great challenges Americans have in the 21st century to build that biotechnology-based economy that is required in order for us to compete in the 21st century is to address this cultural problem. As I said a few minutes ago, in many ways a very traditional country that is nevertheless very dependent on advances in science and technology. So this tension in the culture is one we really, I think, do need to address. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks. Yes?
Why does the government care about the Christian conservatives and the people?
Why does the government care about Christian conservatives?
I mean, why does it matter? Because otherwise, if they do care about it, then India and China are going to go ahead. So it doesn't make logical sense for America to care about it.
So other countries will move ahead in these fields. Look, there are several ways to answer the question. First of all, those folks are Americans. They have a vote. They're part of the constituency. They're entitled to be heard. I'm going to give you the view that I think many of my colleagues on that side of these questions would have. We don't have to do everything here. If something involves selling our souls, why should we do it? Let somebody else do it. Is the technological imperative one that we have to bow to all the time? So why is it necessary for us to do everything? Particularly if there are deep moral qualms in the society about doing this. But then there's another level of question, which is, well, say we haven't criminalized embryonic stem cell research. Well, some states have, in effect, but federally it's not criminalized. The debate has been whether federal funds, taxpayer dollars, your dollars, or your parents' dollars, in some cases, should go to research that a lot of Americans object to. In the 1960s, people tried to withhold some of their taxes, whatever percentage they thought was supporting the Pentagon, because they objected to the Vietnam War. So these people would say, and by the way, some of these are the same people. I objected to the war 40, 50 years ago. Now I object to certain kinds of science. I don't want my money being spent on those things in science any more than I wanted my money being spent on that war. So I'm giving you the strongest response I can, which is that they're part of the culture. They're part of the society. Now the more sort of concrete response would be American politics. There are probably political scientists in this room, so I'm, as usual, going beyond my expertise, but I'll say the obvious. our system is one in which interest group politics are very important. So, for example, what a percentage of people under 30 have voted in the Republican primaries? You know? It's like under 5%. So that group, that interest group, is essentially unrepresented. Who's represented is older people who are pissed off are well represented in those primaries. And people who have, I would say, traditional cultural views are well represented. And of course, we have gerrymandered constituencies now, and particularly in the House. In the House we do, so it's very hard for an incumbent to be defeated. There are lots of reasons why this happens. But it's, in general, in our system, the most vigorous voices, most loudest voices, the most intent voices get the most attention, at least up to a certain point in the presidential cycle. Sir?
In your opinion, who should oversee the work that goes on, say, at that new building on Spruce Street across the hospital, or Moreno Institute, or even NIH? Who most effectively should oversee it and thus keep it out of the political realm?
So I was with you up until, and thus keep it out, because I don't think you can keep it out of the political realm. It's, you know, we are part of the political system. The academy is, and the, God knows science is part of the political system. The question about how values should enter into decisions about what science you do is incredibly complicated. I have to tell you, I don't have a straight answer for it. I don't have a good answer. You know, what we try to do, for example, I'm working for Dr. Gutman's Bioethics Commission now. What we try to do is we try to have people who are experts in various fields, as well as a sort of non-expert on many of these federal advisory committees. So right now, just to give an example of how we try to do this, on the President's Bioethics Commission that Amy Gutman chairs, Lani Ali, who is Muhammad Ali's wife, is on the commission. And her role, I think, is implicitly to represent people who are worried about certain diseases and do not have an expert perspective necessarily, although she knows a hell of a lot about Parkinson's, I can tell you. But don't bring that expert perspective that they're not a partisan of science, per se. They're a partisan of, you know, the consumers of healthcare and the consumers of the life sciences. So that's what we try to do. You know, we try, I mean, what you're asking is, I mean, it's really about representation, right? Whose voices get to be heard? How do they get to be heard? And then the next question is, well, what about evidence? Right? Does evidence matter? At what point does evidence matter? Or at what point do we not want to accept evidence? One of the problems that science has is that it's always challenging itself. You know, so we get new information every week about what we should be eating. The nutrition sciences, I mean, this is at a sort of primal level for most people, right? Like in Sleeper, when Woody Allen woke up and he found out he should have been eating fat all the time. You know, it feels like that every week or every month anyway. I'm told, is caffeine good for me or not? How much salt? You know, is my high blood pressure is that just physiologic? Some people have it. I mean, it's very hard to know because science is always challenging itself. The same is not true of faith. Faiths might challenge each other, but religious faith is very stable. And so we hold, this is a little bit like Doug Hammarskjöld, when Ben Gurion, I think, who asked Doug Hammarskjöld, the old Secretary General of the UN, why are you so hard on us Israelis? Why are you so hard on Israel? Hammarskjöld said, because we hold you to a higher standard. Well, people implicitly, without even realizing, hold science to a higher standard. They want to know, what's true. And when scientists keep coming back and saying even, gee, it might even be that there are particles that are faster than the speed of light. It might be that we can make a synthetic biology can make a cell that has completely new properties. Maybe a cell that we can put into the ocean to eat up bacteria. What's going on here? So this is all, it's very, science is at once able to create all these cool new things. There's nothing around us, including probably what's in our bodies, that is not the product of science and technology. But it's also very disconcerting because even the basics seem to be up for grabs. So, yes?
To what extent do you think this is a result of the failures of the public education system? Is it because would it help to have a generation coming up that had been taught evolution successfully?
Yeah, that is the default view of the science policy people at places like AAAS. You know, if only, and I'm going to exaggerate, of course, as I've done before today, just to make the point, that if only every member of Congress had a PhD in biology, all would be well. Well, you know, there were scientists in charge of the communist bloc countries. You know, they were hydrologists and agronomists, and they were as big a dictator as anybody else. So I'm not sure that having the advanced, that it's a matter of education alone. I think that's part of it. But some of it's cultural. I mean, I had students at the University of Virginia who were homeschooled, who did not believe in evolution, at least that's what they said, and they did fine in their biology courses. So there's a cultural issue here. It's not only cognitive. It's not just sort of the neck up. There are cultural issues here. And by the way, I think also progressives like me have a tendency to think that people of faith object to science in general. I really hate the science, anti-science paradigm. Because, for example, a good colleague at UC San Diego, who is a sociologist of religion, he's actually talked to evangelical Christians about science. Hardly anybody has done that. And he says, you know, and he's written about this, what's really interesting is that it's not science in general that they're concerned about. Faith conservatives are not concerned. It's certain issues in science. The age of the earth, you know, the ultimate destiny of humanity, the dignity of the human spirit. There are certain specific issues that worry them. It's not a general anti-science attitude. They don't lie awake at night worrying about, you know, physical chemistry. Oh my God. You know, it's certain specific issues that, and they do worry about the moral compass, and this is how we ended, the moral compass of scientists. They worry about scientists as an independent party now almost, making decisions for the rest of us, not allowing us to know the secrets of the fraternity. Yes, Joanna?
Dr. Moreno, we have a question from our online audience. Kirk asks, do you have a viewpoint of the use of H-1B visas to fill technological position vacancies in American companies?
Yeah, so the visa question, I'll repeat it. Do I favor H-1?
Do you have a viewpoint?
Do I have a viewpoint? Well, do I have a viewpoint? Yes, we should have more well-educated people getting visas. It's funny, I went to talk to the founder of the wealthiest person I ever talked to is a multi-billionaire, founded a very well-known company, I won't mention, a few years ago, and the only thing he wanted to talk about in science policy was visas. Because he's very concerned that we're making it too hard for people to either stay here or to come here. And it is certainly true. I mean, I've been in China 3 times for a Gates Foundation project. It's certainly true. As we know, they're setting people up in labs. They're letting them come here for their postdocs, but they're bringing them back. And you know, this is fine. Right? The new architecture of science, the new invisible college is what Caroline Wagner at Brookings calls it. The new invisible college is the internationalization of science and teams of scientists working on complementary issues in a globalized fashion. That's the new science. So a question is, how does any political organization, how does a state get to capture the wealth and the value of that knowledge the way it did in the 20th century? I'm not sure we can anymore. So maybe we're too preoccupied with the visa question. So I'm contradicted myself. But it may be that visa question, that old notion that the state can capture the secret and then, you know, turn it into something that has of military value and that has monetary value, that may be done. That may not be the way that the scientific system works anymore. Yep.
How would you see, and I don't know if you can describe it, what happened at Penn in the late 60s around something called Project Splice Rat? I don't know if you know what that is.
Remind me.
A group of students discovered that Penn was engaged in secret journalistic research related to Vietnam. It got published. The trustees found out about it. The trustees were building the University City Science Center in cooperation with other Quaker organizations, which immediately pulled out.
Yeah.
It ended the Science Center development for 20 years at least.
That's interesting.
And the faculty senate supported the students who discovered this almost by accident, by saying secret research has no place at university.
Yeah.
Looking back on that,
Great
saying,
question.
was it a good thing to have stopped research, or was it the right thing because germ warfare research has unintended really bad consequences, and politically we were involved in a war that the students didn't support?
Well, the irony, of course, is that in '69, President Nixon, and then in '71, signed the Biological and Chemical Weapons Toxin Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. So that research for offensive purposes did stop.
After, of course, he had been called out at Penn in '67.
Well, I think there were a lot of reasons. For one thing, it turned out to be a big waste of money. That we weren't learning that much for offensive purposes. I published a book 13 years ago called Undue Risk about the history of secret human experiments, in which I talk about biological and chemical weapons experiments. What is interesting is that the academic industry has no standard on this question of secret or classified research. So supposedly, as I understand it, none of the Ivies will accept classified research. Then there are institutions like Penn State that will accept it. Then there are some like Hopkins or MIT who will accept it, but they kind of put it off campus, right? So you protect academic freedom, but you have these entities that are doing these classified things. My general view is that most stuff that goes on in secret, it doesn't really make a difference. Most of what DARPA pays for, the DoD's Advanced Science Agency, is being done by scientists at universities around the country. They're doing little pieces of projects that DARPA has an interest in, and then the projects end, and then with institutional memory, they may be useful later on, they might not be. DoD is doing a lot of breast cancer research. I'm not comfortable with these categories. Is it military, is it not military? I'm really not, I have to say I'm not too sure what to make of that. I've never thought it was a good idea for ROTC to be pushed off campuses. I think in a society like this, we want to have well-educated officers, and we want them to come from all the strata we can. I guess I'd rather see it here than see it at places where we know nothing at all about it, or people like us can't have anything to say about it. I think this is very complicated. I do think that there are some types of classified work that you probably can't do ethically. For example, a secret human experiment. I don't see how you do that ethically. I think it's because I don't see how people who would object to that can object to it publicly without going to jail. But classified research, I have mixed feelings about this question, because there are so many ways in which you can do it without appearing to be inhibiting academic freedom. So it can be done anyway. Not a very satisfactory answer. I would have opposed Spice Rack at that time for sure, if I'd been here. But we can talk about it some more. Sir. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I think you got the last one.
A layperson in this country can, if they care to pay enough money, get a full body scan and get results that tell you things about you fall outside the normal range and this and that, but not necessarily of any medical value. What do you think about that?
Right. So was it cosmetic neurology, sometimes the term for this? I think that people have the right to do their business if that's what they want to do, and it doesn't cause harm. I mean, look, mostly it's a waste of money. I think the full genome scans are a waste of money. They're not going to tell you. 23andMe, if you look at their website or any of these other companies, it's very clear that they will not tell you the worst things that could happen to you. They're not going to tell you your highest horrible risks. They'll tell you some other things that are sort of interesting. One of my friends found out, for example, that he's really not descended from an Indian princess. Bummer. But then there's some things that can be very disconcerting. For example, there's a story in the Washington Post maybe 3 years ago about an African-American woman who is a leader in her community who decided to do this. Her daughter said, "You should do this. Find out what part of Africa we're from." She was Native American. Like, But however they do these percentages, she was 90% Native American, okay? Now, what does that do to personal identity? So, or the Havasupai Indians, you know that case in Arizona where they found out that they really had not, been brought up from the sands of the valley, but they probably came from the Aleutian Islands or something. So this is entertainment. This is like Fox News and MSNBC, right? These things are entertainment. Some people will make money on them. Obviously, you can read a book by a guy named Zach Lynch, who's the president of the Neurotechnology Industry Organization, who disagrees with me vigorously and believes this is a very important form of public education to have these things done to them. I'm a skeptic. And the fact is, you may find out things about yourself that you don't really want to know. I'm not sure I want to, know everything that my doctor could know about me. This is what a bioethicist many years ago called sort of halfway technology of genetic prophecy. Do we really want to know where we're going? Do we really want to know how we're deteriorating? This is what aging is about. And I'm not so sure. So, but on the other hand, it's a free country. People can make money on this. I guess we have to find a good reason to stop them. But you have a good reason to stop me because I think the pizza's cold. Thank you all, and look forward to talking some more.